unknown dense forest. In this underdeveloped area far from the center of civilization, similar unknown regions are everywhere. Although all the land has lords, not all of it can be reclaimed. The kingdom does not have the extra manpower or resources to develop those border areas near the Gondor wasteland. Thanks to the elves who helped humans build the magnificent wall, with the Sentinel Tower as an ode, stretching around the entire Gondor wasteland. Contemporary countries no longer need to hoard too many troops on the border to deal with the occasional monsters wandering from the wasteland. As air salt, the border has fallen into a vicious cycle of continuous decline. There is more than one way to travel from the Cecil territory to Tanzan Town in the north, but taking the official road through the forest is the shortest. If you choose other routes, you either have to go around the entire area or cross more dangerous no-man's lands, neither of which is a wise choice. The deeper they went into the forest, the dimmer the sky became, and the thick layer of decaying leaves on the ground became more annoying. Although this was not exactly a great forest, a forest left undisturbed by humans, growing wild and freely, truly broadened Gawain's horizons. In his past life, he had lived in an artificial jungle of reinforced concrete. After being transported to this world, for many years he could only observe this world from a distance. Now, stepping into it with his own feet, he realized that his imagination of the natural environment had been too superficial. But fortunately, he was gradually getting used to this body. Its strong physical fitness and comprehensive qualities made it relatively easy for him to face the challenges of wilderness survival. Besides, Sir Byron and Amber beside him had plenty of experience in traversing mountains and forests, so the journey was not too bad. However, Heidi was going to suffer. Even though the Cecil family had fallen, it was still an old noble family with a long history, directly sworn to the king. Heidi, born into it, was a proper noble lady. In the noble circle, this lady was considered well-tempered and able to endure hardships, but in the face of nature's challenges, she still needed some training. What's more, a mage couldn't be too strong physically anyway. Rebecca's performance surprised Gawain Abbott. This girl who looked like a high school girl on Earth hadn't fallen behind along the way. She could even run no worse than those tall soldiers in the forest with no roads at all. When Gawain asked curious lie, Rebecca answered a little shyly, "I was very wild when I was a kid, always running around like a boy, even sneaking into the forest in the territory to explore. At that time, I hadn't shown any magical talent yet, and my father thought I might be trained as Achnite, which disappointed him. Great lie. But even though I called Entebekami Achnite, I still pay attention to exercising regularly. After all, the family motto says that to become a lord who can protect the people, you first need a strong body." Gawain nodded silently. Although this and one time's great-granddaughter sometimes seemed as if she had had her head caught in a door, she was quite simple and honest. This was rare in noble circles. The end-times great-granddaughter next to her, who was almost out of breath, should learn from her quickly. There may be some monsters deep in this forest, but they won't be very strong, Sir Byron said, using his long sword to lift a dark mass from the ground. The mass gradually became transparent at the tip of his sword and then dissipated into the air. Shadow elements are concentrated. There should be a natural magic focal point in the center of the forest, but it should be very weak. Of course it's weak. Amber twirled a delicate small dagger in her hand, looking around as she spoke. If there were a high-quality magic focal point, this forest would have long been claimed by the Arcane Society or the Astromancers Association as theirs since ancient times. And looking at the surrounding plants, there's no obvious mutation, which means the element concentration here Can't even affect the flowers and plants. Gawain looked at these two wilderness survival experts in surprise. You seem to know a lot. Rebecca glanced at Byron. Before swearing allegiance to my father, Uncle Byron was a mercenary. Byron didn't seem too used to talking about the past. It's all in the past, miss. Amber twirled the small dagger in her hand more quickly. T.S. looking so world-weary. Who doesn't have a past? Although the half-elf lady's face was full of my past is also very amazing. So come and ask me, okay? Expressions. Gawain had no intention of cooperating with this girl's performance at all. From just a day and a half of contact, he had learned enough about her temperament. Her rich wilderness knowledge was most likely due to being chased all over the city by the patrol team every now and then and having to escape into the forest to survive in the wilderness. But if you really asked her, she definitely would say that. She would definitely make up a thrilling and magnificent story like having traveled the entire continent and chatted with the Elf King. While talking, they had walked further into the forest. The trees around them grew thicker and thicker, and the sunlight filtering through the canopy became sparser. Gawain looked up. Among the vague branches, the huge sun was split into tiny spots of light, like a giant plate invert and cover in the sky, and the sunlight falling on them seemed a little colder. Betty, the weakest in constitution, couldn't help but sneeze. She felt her hands were so cold that she almost dropped the frying pan. Amber stopped twirling the dagger. She suddenly lowered her body, her light-colored eyes shining with vigilance. She looked at Gawain and exhaled a breath of white air. Don't you think the temperature is a bit too low now? He'd say is suddenly sharpened. The fatigue from make haste to travel was abruptly suppressed. She raised her staff and slammed it hard on the ground, quickly reciting a mouthful of awkward spells. Detect distortion. This was a universal magic spell, learnable from the 2nd level of formal mages, all the way to the 9th level archmages, who had corresponding spell models. This spell had no attack power at all. Its role was to detect hidden energy phenomena within ascertained range, such as hidden magic traps or invisible energy fields. When fully cast, Detect Distortion could detect energy traces up to 1 level higher than the caster's level at most, and Heidi was a 3rd level mage. In terms of professional levels, Heidi, a 3rd level mage, the peak of the low rank, was weaker than Byron, who had entered the middle rank, although only the primary stage. However, in terms of the convenience and versatility of magic, her spells could play a greater role than martial strength. As the effect of Detect Distortion took hold, Gawain found that fog was rising around them. No, it wasn't fog, but previously hidden spiritual energy so dense that it affected the physical world. They gathered from all directions, continuously enriching and strengthening, now so thick that it was almost impossible to see the trees tens of meters away, and in the rolling pale fog, vague shadows could be seen, flashing by from time to time. Betty's eyes widened in horror, and she was about to scream when Gawain covered her mouth. Don't make a sound. It will alarm the things in the fog. The little girl's eyes were wide open, tears almost falling. She nodded hard while clutching the frying pan in her hand. Gawain couldn't help but shake his head. She hadn't tried from fear when she saw the dragon before, but now she was so scared. Everyone has different weaknesses. What are these things? Rebecca was also a little scared. She held her staff tightly, and small sparks were jumping at the tip. When did we get surrounded by these things? Mist of vengeful spirits, damn it. Heidi gritted her teeth. Why is there such a thing here? Gawain had found the corresponding knowledge in his memory. Mist of vengeful spirits was a product that could be produced naturally or artificially, with natural production being more common in places where shadow energy converged and there were undead wandering. Mist of vengeful spirits had a very low probability of appearing. It was part of the shadow environment but was affected by the breath of the undead, making it highly destructive. However, this kind of fog was invisible after appearing. It would take shape and grow in the spirit world, and in the physical world, people couldn't see a trace of it unless the victim had already stepped into the depths of the fog. It would slowly kill the unsuspecting victims who strayed into it through low temperatures and illusions and fears that invaded their minds. Ordinary people who strayed into it often never understood what was happening until they died, because they could see anything until they died. The thick fog would only appear the moment their souls fell into the shadow world and occupy all their dying memories. Artificially creating mist of vengeful spirits was also possible, but the conditions were too harsh. The requirements for the caster were extremely high, and the effect was inferior to most spells of the same level, so those shady necromancers would waste time on this. Gawain had already drawn his Pathfinder sword but didn't attack. Mist of vengeful spirits was very special, although you would be harmed as soon as you entered its range. It didn't actually attack actively at first. All those damages were just the inherent attributes of it as a negative environment. Only when the things in the fog were disturbed would it go berserk, and it was very difficult to deal with after going berserk. Gawain was unsure if the fog had been disturbed, so he didn't order an attack. Instead, he carefully looked for the weak point of the fog, preparing to seize the opportunity to break through. But just as he was doing this, a soft ethereal laugh suddenly came to his ears from somewhere deep in the fog. For fuck's sake, actually being played by a cloud of mist. Gawain immediately raised his long sword and swung it in the direction of the sound. A streak of dark red firelight broke away from the blade, splitting a vague image, emerging from the fog into concentrate fire on that figure darting around in the fog wearing all white. Ethereal and eerie laughter continued to come from the fog, as if a frivolous woman was mocking the confused travelers in the fog. The phantom split in two by Gawain's sword did indeed vanish, but in the next instant, it reorganized elsewhere in the fog. This mist of vengeful spirits actually had a consciousness. Upon realizing this, Hedi felt a thin layer of cold sweat break out on her forehead. The fog first created the mirage of being unconscious, making everyone think the situation was so critical and trying to find a chance to break through. But as time passed during this process, everyone's physical strength would be slightly weakened by the fog. By the time Gawain and his group truly started to break through, everyone's condition would have been damaged to varying degrees. That's when the wraith in the fog would suddenly strike, with disastrous consequences. But perhaps due to the inherent defects in the consciousness of undead creatures, the soft laughter from the fog ruined its or their own trap. Even so, the situation was still terrible. Ordinary soldiers had difficulty play a role in against such strange enemies. They could only rely on the tenacious willpower honed in their daily training to resist the malice and fear constantly seeping from the fog. Betty, who had no combat capability, was immediately protected in the center of the team. The heat surged in Sir Byron's fine steel long sword. He used this sword to continuously dispel the ubiquitous cold and cut off the countless phantom arms stretching out from the fog. Under his protection, Hedi and Rebecca could have a relatively stable casting environment. Hedi chanted spells continuously using various low-level auxiliary spells to weaken the power of the surrounding fog, but Rebecca's attacks were much simpler and more straightforward. She waved her staff, and the only magic she released from beginning to end was fireball. Large and small fireballs flew from the tip of Rebecca's staff into the fog, causing a series of explosions. But the effect was really not good. Fire did have ascertained restraining effect on undead creatures, but mist of vengeful spirits was a very special thing. It was thin and broad, with no entity to withstand an explosion damage. When a fireball exploded in the fog, more than half of its lethality would dissipate. Don't use fireball. Gawain noticed Rebecca's fighting style and quickly shooted Araminder. Use area of effect. Spells they don't need to be very powerful. Just have a large area. Otherwise, the fog will disperse all the attacks. Rebecca shouted back, but I only know how to use fireball. Gawain was shocked. What? Rebecca only knows fireball. Hidi's voice was almost frantic. She's been learning for 5 years and only knows this one spell. Rebecca's face turned red with anger at her own stupidity and magic aptitude. She gathered her powerful magic power, almost using all her strength to constrain it into a spell model, then waved her staff, and a basin-sized fireball flew toward the dense street part of the fog. There was no such thing as achieving sudden enlightenment, making a breakthrough, or having a counterattack at a critical moment. This fireball, far exceeding the standard, caused a far exceeding standard explosion, and even the fog in front of them became thinner for armament. However, almost instantly, the gap in the fog was filled again. Worse still, Gawain suddenly heard a roar full of fear and anger from behind. A family warrior Sais turned blood red. The negative power transmitted by the mist of vengeful spirits finally completely crushed the soldier's soul, and the damage to the soul was immediately reflected in the body. His skin quickly became dry and pale like dried parchment, and the man howled and went crazy. He raised his long sword high and began to slash wildly, as if enemies were all around him. 2 nearby warriors reacted immediately. After dodging the opponent's chaotic attacks, they rushed up and held down the poor madman. The suppressed soldier struggled fiercely, his flesh and blood writhing and twisting as if about to leave his body. His eyes were wide with anger, and he finally raspingly shouted, "Kill me! Kill me!" However, in the eyes of the other 2 soldiers, a cloud of red seemed to be gradually gathering. They ignored their comrade's plea. They were also about to lose their minds. Seeing this, Gawain immediately thrust the Pathfinder's sword into the ground and mobilized the original power of this body according to the methods recorded in his mind. Mind shock. This was one of the few knight abilities that could affect the mind. A powerful will would sweep across the battlefield, causing strong mental oppression to all hostile targets and also producing a strong, inspiring effect on friendly forces. Under the effect of mind shock, the 2 soldiers quickly got rid of the fearful state, but the poor guy they had pinned to the ground had already had his soul completely destroyed by the mist of vengeful spirits. After struggling a few times, he completely stopped moving. Gawain quickly scanned the battlefield with his eyes. He saw that the fog around them not only showed no sign of weakening, but instead seemed to be getting thicker under Hidi and Rebecca's attacks. And in the position where the 3 soldiers had been, Betty was nowhere to be seen. "Where's Betty?" Gawain's heart tightened, and he shouted loudly, "Betty!" Amber jumped out of the nearby shadows. "I just saw that little girl run into the fog. She looked like she was sleepwalking. Damn it, she's lost her mind." Gawain was shocked. "Why is this mist of vengeful spirits so strange?" Amber's face was filled with horror. "I don't know what's strange, but the situation is already terrible. The mist of vengeful spirits isn't dissipating at all. Logically speaking, after being attacked for so long, no matter how powerful the fog is, it should have weakened a bit," Gawain quickly said, making judgments based on the knowledge in his mind. Although those memories were in this, he found that as long as he actively mobilized them, They were as easy to use as his own knowledge and experience. And we also judged before that the magic focal point here would be strong. How could such an ordinary magic focal point give birth to mist of vengeful spirits that can even have intelligence? Amber was smart and understood immediately. You mean this fog was naturally generated? Is there some artificial energy source or something maintaining it? It does thave to be an artificial energy source, but there must be something maintaining it. Gawain frowned and stared at the fog as if he wanted to see through it and understand its nature. And the thing maintaining it should be nearby, but our perceptions are deceived, and we can't see it at all. But Lady Heidi has already used detect distortion, Amber said in confusion, then suddenly opened her eyes wide. Could it not be on this layer? Before the words were even out, Gawain saw the half-elf lady take a step back and disappear into the air. No, she hadn't disappeared. Gawain noticed abnormal shadows floating on the nearby ground, a vague human-shaped silhouette that could vaguely be recognized as Amber's outline. This outline with only a shadow and no body jumped and transferred between nearby planes like teleportation, sometimes appearing on the ground, sometimes on a nearby tree trunk, and only truly disappearing after jumping a few times. That was a real shadow, but the reflection Amber projected into the physical world while walking on the edge of the physical world in a shadow state. Such a simple, crude, and powerful shadow walk amazed Gawain. Where did this half-elf thief come from? Before Gawain could ask more questions, Amber's figure suddenly reappeared in the air, and she rushed toward him. Just as Gawain was about to ask what was going on, she grabbed his arm and pulled him hard. Gawain stumbled, then felt like he had passed through a cold, illusory barrier. When his vision focused again, the surrounding environment had changed. All colors had disappeared from everything, leaving only black and white in the world. A thin layer of fog covered this world. The fog was cold, but it didn't save the life-draining power of the mist of vengeful spirits. Gawain looked around and found that the dense forest had vanished. Instead, the ground was covered with one dried tree stump after another, their positions exactly matching those of the trees in the forest. Everyone, including Heidi, stood not far from him, but they were as stiff as if struck by a petrification spell, motionless. Rebecca was the close street to Gawain. She maintained a posture of gripping her staff tightly, her face tense, but her eyes were empty and grayish white. Now a statue, she stared blankly ahead, her skin like rough ceramic. Thin strands of black fog rose from the ground around them, seeping into their bodies and creating tiny cracks on their ceramic-like skin. The eerie scene made Gawain instinctively check his own hands. Relieved to see they were still human, he gripped his Pathfinder sword and stepped toward Rebecca, intending to cut through the obviously harmful black fog. But before he could take a full step, Amber suddenly appeared beside him, clutching his arm tightly. Don't take it close. External force can help them. You might make it worse. Gawain stared at Amber in astonishment. She looked completely different in this black and white world. Her hair had grown longer, floating weightless lie behind her. Her light brown eyes now glowed with a faint golden light, while a swirl of black smoke, like flames, gathered at her feet, constantly coalescing and dissipating. Gawain de Cecil's memories held no explanation for this sight. Don't ask too many questions. It'll be awkward if I don't answer, especially since I just dug up your grave. I'd feel guilty, Amber said rapidly. We ray on a tight schedule. I've never gone this deep before, and with you along, who knows how long we can last. What is this place? Gawain asked his most pressing question. The Shadow Realm, Amber said flatly, nodding toward Heidi and the others. Look, there at the spot where Betty and the soldiers had stayed. One soldier now lay on the ground, shattered into countless pale fragments, literally like a broken porcelain doll. The others, including Rebecca, still held the poses and expressions they'd had when first encountering the mist of vengeful spirits. But at Betty's feet, a trail of glowing tiny footprints extended forward. The Shadow Realm. Gawain was unsure how the human nations of today understood the Shadow Realm, but in the memories he had inherited, the Gondor Empire of over 700 years ago had conducted considerable research in this regard. Those scholarly experts, with their heads full of white hair, spent day after day poring over dull ancient books and data, staring at the crystal lattice rulers buried in the magic wells to deduce the true appearance of this world. And there was a classic model used to describe the stratification of the world. In this classic model, scholars believed that the world was divided into several realms. The uppermost was the most stable material realm, where everything followed laws, could be directly touched, and was easy to observe. It was also the realm where most creatures in the world resided. Below, the material realm was the Shadow Realm, which most humans could indirectly access. The Shadow Realm was a distorted reflection of the material realm. Ordinary humans could directly contact or observe it, but they could perceive and measure it through magic and spiritual techniques. Further down from the Shadow Realm was the Umbral Realm, an even more illusory and mysterious area that was a reflection of the Shadow Realm. It had reached a level where no magic or spiritual power could explore it. Some lucky mages had managed to capture a few shadow creatures with basic intelligence and the ability to communicate, from whose fragmented words they guessed the existence of the Umbral Realm. Some radical scholars had expanded this classic model, believing that there might be deeper realms below the Umbral Realm, but that layer belonged to the domain of the gods, the foundation of origin laid by the creator god when making the world, no longer within the scope of mortal research. In Gawain's understanding, this model was like layers of translucent craft paper. The real image of the physical world was at the front, and its shadow was projected onto each layer of paper, becoming more blurred and distorted as it went further back. He and Amber were in the back of the first piece of paper, the Shadow Realm. Even though it was only the second layer, it was still a place that most humans had never set foot in. He wisely didn't ask Amber why she had the ability to enter the Shadow Realm at this moment. Moreover, from Amber's previous words, he could tell that she was also entering such a deep place for the first time. If he asked, he would probably get no answer. There were still many secrets in this world worth exploring, and many things could be understood just by observing from above for many years. After a simple judgment, Gawain thought that following Betty's footprints was the only breakthrough point. But before leaving the scene, he still looked back worriedly. Hetty, Rebecca, and the others were still standing there like porcelain dolls. Their real bodies were resisting the invasion of the grudge mist in the real world, but in the projection of the Shadow Realm, they were frozen at the moment of the attack, and the black mist seeping up from the ground was constantly disintegrating them. Fortunately, judging by the speed of the mist's erosion, they still had some time. Maybe this is the true state of the grudge mist, Amber said, shaking her head as she followed Gawain's gaze. How much do you think this discovery of ours would be worth if we sold it to the Arcane Society or the Astromancers Association? They probably pour a bunch of potions down your throat, tie a recording crystal to your head, and then use a banishment spell to throw you into the Shadow Realm as a human probe. Gawain gave Amber a sideways look. Come on. The main thing is important. As Amber followed behind Gawain, she kept muttering, but you can be the one to do it. After all, you're the founding ant store of Ansu. Would they really pour potions on an ant store? What do you think? Gawain twitched the corner of his mouth. They'd be happy to hang me on the wall, write about me in books, put me on a table as an offering, and even the king would be willing to lead his whole family to place a bouquet of flowers in front of me every year and give himself 3 days off, no risk, and a good reputation. But if this aunt's store really jumped out of the coffin, the first reaction of those who put me on the pedestal before would probably be to push me back into the coffin, nail 200 nails from all sides, and some might even pour lead. Amber was stunned. Why? Gawain looked at this half-elf who was entwick on the uptake and threw back irritably, because the 3-day tomb-sweeping holiday for the whole country would be gone. After saying this, Gawain strode forward, leaving Amber behind to react for a long time before she suddenly shouted, "Wait, you got it wrong. There's no holiday for sweeping your tomb. Only a 3-day holiday for paying homage to the founding kings. You died too early to know." Gawain almost stumbled and fell, although he dissuaded Amber from the idea of selling the Shadow Realm information. Gawain had his own plans. He was curious about this Shadow Realm, or rather, he was curious about the whole world. So one day he would figure it all out. The string of footprints didn't extend far, perhaps due to the special environment of the Shadow Realm. The habit of judging distance in the material world was difficult to apply here. Gawain and Amber had only followed the footprints for a short distance when a wooden house suddenly appeared in front of them. The wooden house was small and dilapidated, and it was unclear how long it had stood there. A circle of incomplete fence could be seen around the wooden house. Judging by the sparseness of the fence, it probably couldn't serve any defensive purpose anymore. In one corner of the wooden house, Gawain noticed a touch of color. It was the color of moss, which stood out sharply in this black and white world, and as time passed, that little bit of color was fading rapidly. Betty's footprints led all the way to the door of the wooden house. Amber pulled out her small dagger and nervously gestured in front of her chest. "Later, you, sir, can just charge in with celestial descent and hack and slash, and I'll cover you from behind." Gawain thought about it and held back the urge to grab Amber by the collar and throw her into test for traps. Instead, he put one hand on the hilt of the sword of the pioneers and the other hand carefully pushed open the grayish-white door. However, no attack came. The inside of the wooden house was just an ordinary room, old and dilapidated, like an old black and white photo. But there was someone inside. A man with a beard and wearing a tattered short robe sat behind the square table in the middle of the wooden house. He was so haggard and weathered that Gawain couldn't determine his real age at all. Behind this man, there were 2 wooden shelves filled with bottles and jars and an old alchemy table. Everywhere in the room, there were devices for magic experiments, but they were all piled up with more tattered, miscellaneous items. Any normal mage who saw this shabby and miserable scene would probably want to cry. The man behind the square table looked up in Gawain's direction and gave a stiff smile. "Guests, it's been a long time since there were guests in my laboratory, and 2 at once." Amber stuck her little head out from beside Gawain, with a look of vigilance on the half-elf girl's face. No fight? Gawain didn't draw his sword, but he didn't let his hand get too far from the hilt either. He entered the wooden house in a state ready to attack at any time. "We were passing by and came to look for someone, a girl about 15 or 16 years old, carrying a frying pan." However, the man behind the table seemed not to have heard Gawain's swords. He just smiled dully and nodded slightly. "Please find a place to sit. Annie is preparing lunch. There's no place to rest in the deep mountains and old forests. If you don't mind, stay here for a meal." "Annie?" Gawain asked subconsciously. "My daughter." The man smiled she's very well behaved. At this time, a girl's exclamation came from the side. Master? Gawain looked in the direction of the sound and saw Betty standing by a small door in the corner of the wooden house with a surprised expression. Betty, it's good that you're okay. Gawain immediately breathed a sigh of relief. I'm here to pick you up. However, Betty shook her head slightly, and the man behind the square table also looked at the little girl and asked gently, Annie, is lunch ready? Betty nodded obediently. Almost, Dad. The little girl turned and went into the kitchen. Gawain and Amber exchanged a look. After confirming that the strange man behind the square table had no reaction, they followed. Betty was cooking in the kitchen with her precious frying pan. A cluster of pale flames was leaping in the stove, and the sausage in the frying pan was sizzling. Amber's focus was very strange. You can even cook in the shadow realm? What's going on here? Gawain came to Betty's side and asked in a low voice. From the little girl's demeanor and behavior, it could be judged that she was under the influence of spells like mind control. But she was staying here to cook of her own free will and called the strange man outside Dad, which was really a bit strange. I'm not very sure either, Betty said with her usual confused look on her face, but the man outside seems to have mistaken me for his daughter. Amber's eyes widened. And you just obediently took him as your father? Betty shook her head. He's very pitiful, so I thought I'd cook him a meal before leaving. Gawain and Amber looked at each other. Then Betty suddenly reached into the pocket of her maid's dress and took out an old notebook, which she handed to Gawain. Master, here, this is what that man gave me. There are many things in it that I can't understand, but you should be able to understand. Gawain took the not very thick notebook in confusion and quickly flipped through the last few pages after opening it. Amber leaned forward curiously. What is it? Let me see. Magic formulas? Rune arrangements? The half-elf lady, confused by those complex symbols and formulas, looked up and said blankly to Gawain, so that strange old man is actually a mage? Strictly speaking, a wild mage. Gawain rolled up the notebook and knocked it on. Amber sheed. And didn't you see all those magic experimental equipment when you first entered the door? In the black and white shadow realm, Gawain, Amber, Betty, and an unnamed wild mage sat around a simple wood and house, with the lunch Betty had just made. In front of them, simple bread slices, fried sausages, and some vegetable soup. It was all colorless, like an old black and white photo. Gawain had no intention of touching the food in front of him, although one could indeed cook in the shadow realm. He really was unsure what would happen if he, a living human, probably ate food from the shadow realm. Amber and Betty next to him also didn't move their cutlery. The wild mage across the table didn't urge them. He just silently ate the food in front of him, looking very quiet. A strange sense of tacit understanding lingered in the wood and house. Gawain was the first to break the silence. How long have you been here? For a long time. The wild mage put down his cutlery, looking very polite. I've lived here since the second year after leaving the Arcane Society. You were once a member of the Arcane Society? Gawain asked in surprise. I thought you'd always been a wild mage. I was originally a second level member of the Arcane Society, the wild mage said quietly. According to the Arcane Society standards, I'm a clumsy spellcaster. I am good at calculation and reasoning, but I lack the ability to turn them into spell models. In other words, my spellcasting level has always been at the elementary stage. Such mages are not welcome in the Arcane Society. So they drove you away? Amber found it incredible. She knew that aerial mage was very valuable, even if his spellcasting level was clumsy, was only compared to those arcane masters. In the eyes of ordinary people, even a mage who could only cast a small fireball was A big shot, even if these grassroots spellcasters were not valued in the arcane society. They wouldn't be kicked out. I left by myself. The wild mage shook his head and turned to look at Betty. For my daughter, to cure her I had to leave. Betty looked at the wild mage blankly and then nodded. Foolish lie. Gawain didn't dwell on this issue. Instead, he stared into the wild mage's eyes, his right hand resting on the hilt of the sword at his waist, and said slowly, "You should know why we ray here. We don't have much time to waste." The wild mage's stiff and dull expression finally changed slightly. His body trembled slightly, and then he lowered his head. Guessed, "I don't quite understand what you mean." Betty looked at Gawain nervously. "Master?" Gawain frowned. After a moment, he moved his hand away from the hilt of the sword of the pioneers and softened at his tone. "Then wait a while." The wild mage lowered his head and continued to eat his meal quietly and silently. The only extra movements he made while eating were occasionally looking up at Betty. Food would eventually be finished, and Gawain couldn't wait indefinitely. The wild mage took the last bite of sausage and then carefully wiped the vegetable soup in the soup plate with a slice of bread. After finishing his meal, he looked up in Betty's direction, but his eyes weren't actually focused on Betty, but on a more distant place. He swayed, as if trying to stand up, but failed several times. Finally, Betty helped him up. "Dad, I'm leaving," the little girl said, holding the wild mage's arm and letting go only after confirming that he was standing steadily. She shuffled to Gawain's side. "Miss Rebecca and Mrs. Hetty are still waiting for me, and Master has come." The wild mage's lips moved, and finally, he nodded slightly. His expression had calmed down, and he gave careful instructions. "Don't eat things given by strangers. Go to bed on time. Remember to listen to the teacher. Don't fight with other children." The light of reason was gradually fading from this poor man Sais. Gawain knew that everything he was saying now was just babble, although he had hardly been sober throughout before. The wild mage's figure gradually faded, but a flame-like thing suddenly burned in the increasingly dim phantom. Gawain had been waiting for this moment. He quickly drew the sword of the pioneers, and a faint light surged on the blade. Amber quickly pulled Betty into her arms and covered the little girl Sais in time. Gawain thrust the sword into the flame in the wild mage's chest. The flame trembled violently. The wild mage, who had been transforming into an evil spirit, suddenly stopped transforming. His illusory figure quickly solidified back into a solid body, and then the raging flames engulfed him and burned him into a hideous charred corpse. The burning lasted for a full half-a minute before the body was completely reduced to ashes. Crackling sounds came from all directions. The small wooden house quickly disintegrated after losing its owner. Dense cracks covered the walls and roof in the blink of an eye. The pale light from the outside world shone into the house through the cracks in the wood and boards. Gawain pulled Amber and Betty and ran out of the house quickly, and the moment they ran out, the wooden house collapsed completely. The collapsed wood and house caught fire in front of them. The fire lasted for a short time, as if what was burned was a wooden house but a paper house. As the wooden house gradually turned into ashes and drifted away with the wind, Amber suddenly pulled Gawain's arm and pointed to the foundation of the wood and house, exclaiming, "Hey, look at that!" Gawain concentrated and saw that, under the ashes of the wood and house, a cluster of flashing lines lit up. The light shone through the floating ashes and gradually formed a complex and huge structure. It was obvious lie the appearance of a large magic circle. This is probably the wild mage's highest achievement in his life. Gawain nodded slightly. It's probably also because this magic circle went wrong that he ended up in this situation. As he spoke, Betty's figure began to gradually turn into floating light spots. These light spots danced in place for the circles and then quickly flew in the direction from which Gawain and Amber had come. Amber looked down at her own hands. Her hands, which had originally turned grayish white, were now regaining their blood color, and as color returned to her and Gawain, the Shadow Realm's repulsion of them became more and more obvious. Some indistinct things condensed from the thin mist around them. They had no form at all, but they were clearly hostile. The native residents of the Shadow Realm had finally smelled the scent of outsiders. Some things from the shallowest layer emerged, gathering like hyenas that had smelled blood. "We have to retreat," Amber said to Gawain. "This place is starting to unwelcome us." Gawain took a deep last look at the ruins of the small house, trying to memorize those glowing lines and symbols in his mind, and then pulled Amber's arm. "Let's go." After a short dizziness, the scene of the real world appeared in front of him again. The grudge mist had dissipated, and the dense forest had returned to its original appearance. Just a few hundred meters away from where everyone was attacked, Gawain found the small wooden house that had become ruins. It lay among the trees. The charred marks indicated that it had been destroyed by a fire starting from within, but the flames hadn't spread further. Perhaps a timely rain had saved the forest. Sir Byron inspected the remaining traces around the wooden house and concluded that the fire must have occurred over half a month ago. Hetty detected every faint magical reaction at the scene. "What we saw in the Shadow Realm was probably a reflection," Gawain said, looking at the ruined wood and house in the forest clearing and stating his judgment. "This wild mage has lived in seclusion here for years. It's outside the territory, and even hunters don't come here, so no one knew there was a hermit living here at all. The problem is, how did the accident happen?" Hetty frowned. "There's only a weak magical focal point here, and the wild mage living here was also very low powered. Even if one of his magic experiments went out of control and burned down this house, he could end. They've created a long-lasting projection in the Shadow Realm and generated such a powerful grudge mist. The magic required for all this isn't something a mere wild mage could provide. Maybe this notebook can answer your questions," Gawain said, handing a tattered notebook to Hetty. It was the same notebook obtained from Betty in the Shadow Realm earlier. It served as both the anonymous wild mage's diary and research notes. Following Gawain's instructions, Hetty opened the latter part of the notebook and began to read carefully. "Answer year 729 Fire Moon, XX day. I've been in this place for half a year. I found a magical focal point on the edge of the Cecil family's territory. Although its intensity can compare with the public magical focal points in the Thousand Tower City, it's enough to support my laboratory. The elemental forces here are single and stable, and Annie's condition should improve. Answer year 729 Harvest Moon, XX day. Annie seems to be getting better. She has had an attack for a long time, but is still daunty. Know if it's the effect of the environment here or if my rituals and potions are really effective. The magical focal point here is too weak. Even with the help of the amplification magic circle, the effect of my rituals will be greatly reduced. Maybe I should reconsider those formulas I'd rived before. Although those people in the Arcane Society always mocked my calculations, I've left the Arcane Society anyway, and they can't control me here. Answer year 730 Mist Moon, XX day. Those formulas and derivations are completely in line with expectations. No, it should be said that things have developed as I calculated under the new amplification method. The power of the magical focal point has been greatly enhanced. With the help of additional magic, I can finally carry out the next stage of treatment for Annie. Although she has had an attack for months, The treatment must continue because she can't afford more torture. Answer year 731 cold moon. XX day. After the treatment, Annie can actually get up and walk around. And she even cooked a meal for me. There were fried sausages and vegetable soup. I feel like I haven't eaten such delicious food in 100 years, although the sausages were burnt and the vegetable soup had no salt. Facts have proved that my treatment plan is effective. As long as this magical focal point here can continue to supply Magic Street ably, Annie's recovery is just around the corner. After that, the diary content was more about the writer's daily life with his daughter. Hetty quickly skipped over this part until she saw some scribbled and messy records on the last few pages. Answer year 730 for Frost Moon. XX day. Annie had an attack. Damn it. I didn't know what went wrong. All the treatments were carried out as planned. Every step of the ritual was correct. And the potions too, they've been used for years without any problems. But Annie still had an attack. And it was severe. Worse than every previous one. I must find the reason as soon as possible. I'll write down all the details. All of them. I'll find the reason. Annie will be okay. Answer year 730 for Frost Moon. XX day. Annie still hasn't improved. The new potion has no effect at all. She's still getting weaker. And she's gradually leaving this world. This morning, I saw her hands become as transparent as mist, and there were many blisters on her face. The world is rejecting her, pushing her into the shadow realm. What should he do? Answer year 730 for Mist Moon. XX day. That damn sun. Its dark red patterns are like mocking my powerlessness. I've finally found the problem, but I can solve it at all. Elements are enriching, abnormally enriching, and magic is surging. This weak magical focal point can't contain the excessive magic at all. Even if I remove those amplification magic circle, it's useless. It would be wise to let Annie stay away from the element-rich place now, but she's been here too long. Her body is resonating with the elemental environment here. This resonance has prolonged her life, but it will also kill her. Answer year 730 for Mist Moon. XX day. The magic in the whole area is abnormal and turbulent. The border of the Cecil territory is like falling into the legendary sea of magic. I can't traverse the changes in Annie anymore. Half of her body has now left the material world, and this morning she even said she saw the whole house turn black and white. Maybe I can only find another way. Answer year 735. Fire Moon. The long preparation is finally over, and Annie's weakness has reached the limit. This is my only chance. There's no other choice. Since I can't let Annie live in the material world, I might as well choose another path. The shadow transformation ritual is record-ed in books, but it requires unimaginable huge magic. However, for me, it may not be unachievable. I used new amplification formulas and magic circle drawing methods and will borrow the power of the surging magic. The magic in this area is in an abnormal, active state. The energy accumulated in the magical focal point has been suppressed by me for months, and it's finally barely enough today. Next, as long as I wait until the sun rises to the middle of the sky when the magic is the strongest, I can start the transformation. Annie, hold on. Dad will save you, and Dad will go to the shadow realm with you. We'll live there for a long time, and you'll never feel pain again. The diary ended here, just as Hetty was about to close the notebook. Gowan suddenly pointed to the corner of the last page. There are actually a few words here. Hetty quickly looked closely. There was a dark ink stain in the corner. She had originally thought it was dirt from a spilled ink bottle, but now after careful identification, she realized it was actually messy handwriting, written with a finger dip in ink. Magic lost control. The sun is red. Hetty repeated these words in confusion. The sun is red. How can the sun be red? Could it be during the last red spot outbreak? Rebecca suddenly read something and said, "It was half a month ago. There were many more red spots on the sun's surface than usual." If this wild mage was not in his right mind at the time, he might have thought the sun was red. Hetty blinked, as if accepting Rebecca's statement. Then she shook the notebook in her hand. With this notebook, many things can be explained. It seems that this unnamed mage set up a large-scale magic array here to treat his daughter. Later, he even came up with the crazy idea of transforming both himself and his daughter into shadow forms to extend their lives. But his transformation ritual got out of control due to the surging magic, resulting in the fire half a month ago, the formation of the grudge mist, and what the ant store saw in the shadow realm. These are not the key points. Gawain suddenly interrupted Hetty's swords. Whether it's the grudge mist or the wooden house in the shadow realm, these can all be directly explained in the notebook. I want you to look at the details mentioned in the notebook. One is about the dark red patterns on the sun's surface, and the other is the large-scale red spot outbreak on the sun's surface. Noticing the serious expression on Gawain's face, Hetty became nervous. Ancestor, these two things. Gawain waved his hand. Besides, as mages, you two should have also felt the magic surging mentioned by this wild mage in the diary, right? Hetty and Rebecca looked at each other and nodded simultaneously. There have indeed been several magic surges in the Cecil territory recently, but magic surges are very normal things. All the magic in the world comes from the sun, and the sun is changing every moment, so the magic on the ground naturally fluctuates. Although the magic surges in the territory have been frequent recently, they haven't been significant enough to attract attention. Gawain looked at the two of them and said slowly, "In Gondor year 1736, various parts of the empire reported observing large-scale dark red patterns on the sun's surface. In 1738, the largest scale red spot outbreak in history was observed, with nearly half of the sun's surface covered by red patches. In the same year, 26 provinces within the empire reported large-scale magic surges. The surges were not large in scale, but they covered nearly 2/3 of the country. In 1739, the blood sun shone in the sky, and the whole country was shrouded in a dark red sky. But at that time, no disaster broke out. Instead, a large number of babies with outstanding magical talents were born. According to records, nearly 1/3 of the newborns on that day had innate elemental affinity, and the newborn detection agencies all over the place even experienced a shortage of resonance stones. Therefore, court scholars declared that day as the Magic Dawn. But in the same year, the Deep Blue Well, the largest magic supply facility near the Gondor imperial capital, exploded. The cause of the explosion was that the magical focal point where the Deep Blue Well was located was suddenly filled with chaotic and powerful magic, and the extraction magic circle could end to handle these chaotic forces, eventually leading to a core meltdown. Gawain stopped, but Hetty continued with a pale face. In Gondor year 1740, the magic tide broke out, and the most powerful human empire in history was destroyed within a few months. After Hetty finished speaking, almost everyone present subconsciously swallowed, except for Betty the little girl simply didn't understand. Rebecca couldn't help but think of the monsters that had destroyed her family's territory. Those monsters were the products of the magic tide. She had previously thought that those monsters had wandered over from the Gondor wasteland, crossed the Grand Wall, and invaded Anzu. After all, the Cecil territory was located on the southern border of Anzu, close to the Gondar wasteland. If a problem occurred in one of the sentinel towers, causing a breach in the Grand Wall, it was conceivable that some monsters would escape. But now, Rebecca couldn't help but think of a worse possibility. What if those monsters didn't come from the Gondar wasteland but were naturally generated in the Cecil territory? What if those monsters meant a new magic tide? Are we being too nervous? Amber was the first to break the silence. The half-elf lady tried to squeeze out Asmol and pointed to the notebook in Hetty's hand. It's Shustadiary left by a wild mage, and the content is unclear. Do we need to directly link it to the magic tide? Gawain didn't refute her but nodded instead. Well, it's also possible that I am being too nervous after all. It was just random analysis based on the inherited memories in his mind. Although it was really satisfying to recite the historical events of 700 years ago in the first person at one go, he also felt that it was a bit alarmist after reciting them. That's right, Amber said, relieved to see Gawain nod. You've been dead for 700 years, and your mind is still stuck in the past. No, you experienced the magic tide back then, and you probably have too much psychological shadow from that time. Ouch! Rebecca hit the half-elf on the head with a staff and glowered at her. Don't be rude to the ancestor. Gawain looked at Rebecca's staff with a strange expression, thinking that this little girl didn't seem to think it was rude when she beat the ant store with the resting staff technique not long ago. No matter how credible these things are, we must report them to His Majesty the King when we arrive in St. Suniel, Hetty said, returning the notebook to Gawain. As for how much the king will believe that and our influence. Gawain silently put away the notebook and suppressed all kinds of complicated thoughts in his heart. Then he looked up at the huge sun in the sky. There was no canopy blocking above the forest clearing, and the sky was open. A huge sun was now rising to the highest point of the day. Its enormous and oppressive crown of light brought light, heat, and the power of magic to this world. Perhaps it was this last element that gave this world natural laws completely different from those on Earth. Gawain's gaze wandered over the surface of the huge sun. Those faint lines were probably storms on the surface of the gas giant. He tried to find those ominous dark red patterns among them but found nothing in the end. Those lines were probably really only fleeting and had now disappeared. However, the sense of urgency in Gawain's shirt didn't disappear. He just pressed it down for the time being and silently planned the path he would take in the future. First, gain a foothold in this world, even if it shoots a down and out old family. But having a starting point is better than being transmigrated into a wilderness grave. After crossing the dense forest, the journey became much smoother. It seemed that the law of conservation of character really existed. The group no longer encountered attacks from monsters or strange natural phenomena. They successfully stepped onto the official road and even met a small caravan on the way. After paying enough money, Gawain and his party finally got rid of the dilemma of crossing mountains and ridges on foot and were able to sit in the caravan's carriage and head for Tanzan town. The caravan boss was a fat northerner who came from the wealthy areas of the kingdom to do business in the southern border, selling local specialties and herbs. It was said that he had originally planned to go to the Cecil territory for the last deal, but he heard about the terrible disaster that happened in the Cecil territory on the way and had to turn back halfway. At first, the fat merchant was a little wary and resistant to Gawain and his party, who were full of a murderous aura, but Hetty finally convinced the cautious caravan boss with 2 gold coins, and even made the caravan boss give up his own carriage. Gold is indeed the most eloquent business negotiation expert convinced. On the 7th day after leaving the Cecil territory, the gates of Tanzan town finally appeared before everyone. This was the first time Gawain had come into close contact with a human town in this world, of course. When he first left the Cecil territory, he climbed a mountain to take a look at his nominal manor estate. But at that time, the entire Cecil region had been turned into ruins by the rioting elemental forces and sprayed into an abstract painting by a blue dragon that didn't know where it came from. It was really impossible to see any local customs, and the current Tanzan town didn't give him every good feeling. It could even be said to be a bit disappointing. Tanzan town was large in scale, this was what Rebecca said, probably because it was located on a plain with fertile land and close to a river. This place was one of the most populous towns in the southern region, with nearly 10,000 people living on this triangular flat land. The Whitewater River came from the west and divided into two in front of Tanzan town, flowing past the north and south sides of the town. It irrigated the large farmland near the town and was also the transportation lifeline here. In the east of the town was a mine, which was the most important economic source of the whole town, but in such a place that had fertile fields, a mine, and a river that could be used as a shipping route, and which looked like a geomantic treasure land. What Gawain saw most after entering the town were sallow and emaciated common people, countless low and dilapidated wood and houses, and dirty streets emitting various odors, because the civilization of this world was far from developed enough to allow humans to crush nature and put all kinds of monsters and beasts into zoos. And because there were often conflicts in the border areas, the whole town was surrounded by a low city wall. The dilapidated civilian areas were piled up inside the city wall, crowded together like moss and sores. Those shabby houses had no aesthetic feeling at all and could only barely provide shelter from the wind and rain. From the city gate to the center of the town, there was a wide avenue, but the scenery on that avenue was not much better. Gawain sat in the caravan's carriage and looked at the scene on the street outside. He saw those poor people wearing short-sleeved shirts walking on both sides of the street. Only a small number of them had shoes on their feet, and most of the rest were tied with rags. There were even poorer people who couldn't even afford rags mixed in. Those walking in the middle of the street were obviously dressed cleaner and had shoes to wear. They didn't communicate with each other or even have conflicts. They just walked quietly on their own paths, like being in a different world, clearly living in the same town and walking on the same road. They were as sharply divided as people from two different worlds. Gawain searched through Cecil's memories but found that there was not much reference in this part. Gawain Cecil was born in the glorious Gondar Empire and grew up in a wealthy area where such scenes did not exist in that era and place. Later, when Gawain searched through Cecil's memories but found that there was not much reference in this part. Gawain Cecil was born in the glorious Gondar Empire and grew up in a wealthy area where such scenes did not exist in that era and place. Later, when the magic tide broke out in Gondar, Cecil led the people to fight a bloody path to the north, and everyone shared weal and woe along the way, with no distinction between high and low. After that, Ansu was founded, and the pioneers built a kingdom on a wilderness, starting from scratch. And even several founding dukes and the king himself had the experience of putting down their swords and plowing the fields. So how could he have seen such a scene? And then Gawain Cecil died in battle on the southern border. This hero, who died young at the age of 35, never lived to see the day when the country he founded experienced polarization between the rich and the poor. So he could only ask his descendants for advice and inquire about the rules on the road. Those walking on the sides of the road are serfs and mine slaves. Hetty explained, there are also poor free peasants from the outlying are as they are not allowed to walk on the main road because they can afford to donate money for road construction. Those walking in the middle of the road are decent townspeople, as well as merchants or mercenaries from outside. These people can afford to pay various taxes, so they are allowed to walk in the middle of the road. Gawain read the few coins the fat merchant had given to the gate guards when the caravan entered the town. Those must have been the entrance taxes. Then he thought of the soldier who had been buried in the forest, the son of a serf. He was able to take up arms and die for the Lord only because of Rebecca's favor. But even though he died for the Lord, he was not allowed to be buried as a soldier because he had not yet redeemed himself. He had not even redeemed his own sword. "Is there a problem, ancestor?" Hetty asked with some confusion, noticing the changing expressions on Gawain's face. Gawain withdrew his gaze from outside the carriage and shook his head slightly. "No, there's no problem." He was just instinctively resistant to these things as a teamy traveler, but it was not yet time for him to criticize or correct them, because he still didn't know enough about this world. After a short period of thought, he looked at Hetty. "What are your plans next?" Hetty obviously had a plan. "First, we'll go to see the local lord, Viscount Andrew. He's relatively reasonable, and we should be able to contact Sir Philip through him more easily. If everything goes well with Sir Philip, we can find the troops that broke through that day. Then we'll decide whether to settle the subjects in place first or go directly to the royal capital. What happened in Cecil territory can be handled by sending one or two messengers. Rebecca must go to see the king in person to explain the situation." Gawain thought it was okay, mainly because he, as an ant store who had been transmigrated and had a 700-year gap with modern people, really could come up with any suggestions. "Then let's do that first."